I suppose I'll start because I'm the one, I always am the one that approaches people. And I knocked at Dan's door, who's the most wonderful digital artist, but he'll tell you about himself, what he's about to bring out and what we're trying to do together. As you can see from my background, this is my father's book, The Long Night. I'm very concerned about Holocaust education, commemoration, memory, and when the survivors go, how we keep that memory alive. And nothing, I don't have to tell an audience like yours, will compete with a survivor, a living survivor, or his story in front of us. And so I think the memory will need to become multifaceted. And I think we have to use what's available today, and that is today, and tomorrow's future is digital. So I turned to Dan rather crassly and I said, Dan, please make me a game of The Long Night. And I told Dan that I'm a sort of gamer in that I play Candy Crush, if any of you are familiar. And I said, couldn't we just do Candy Crush, the Jew and the Nazi? Or can't we do these popular games? And he's saying, no. And I'm not a gamer. Where people just shoot and bang, the thrill of winning. And of course, I don't have to tell you, there are lots of pitfalls. So I'm going to go over to Dan, who is the head and the heart. And I say the heart because it's always difficult for me to hand over my project. It's very important for me that the person I work with has the both, the heart and the head. And I know that Dan gets it and more than gets it, especially who wouldn't speak like me about Candy Crush and Pow Pows. So over to Dan.
Hi everybody. So I can definitely confirm we're not making Candy Crush. So just a little bit about, I suppose, our partnership. This is a very early stage work for us, and a very new kind of collaboration for me. So I'm a digital artist and writer, currently mostly working with quite complex interactive fiction. I'm about to release a large-scale interactive fiction work called Closed Hands, which looks at extremism and its effects on communities. It's a 140,000 word, 5-story, big intertwined game that's coming out on March the 5th. And the reason I tell you about this is that the way that we have built that kind of experience maps quite similarly to the project that Noemie's brought to me, which is to adapt quite a serious piece of text into a new form for a new audience. And I suppose the challenge really is that I suppose the reason it exists is to take quite a serious Holocaust account and take it to audiences who typically would not be interacting with this kind of text, and represent it in a new form, while doing so delicately, sensitively, but not in such a way that it would put the audience off. So it's quite a tricky balance to get right. And it's something that I've encountered on Closed Hands, which has been a 2-year project, and is, you know, the main descriptor for the game is unflinching, which is, you know, not from me, but it's something that sums it up quite well. It's a very serious piece of work. And The Long Night is very, very similar. So the task is really to take that and keep the tone of it without losing the audience. We think about the audience a lot for this kind of work as well. It's very, very important to do it early stage. And for us, Noemie and I have spoken a little bit about this recently, the idea that we're using the word game, but I think the definition of game changes depending on who you speak to. And it's the age-old problem that a lot of games audiences will decide whether or not something is or isn't a game. And, you know, the question straight away for me is a text-based game that you can't win or lose, but you can just experience still a game? I'd argue, yeah, because the bit that we get from games and the bit that I'm interested in is player agency. You know, representing a text as a linear piece of film, for example, would be perfectly legitimate and fine, and is done very, very well. But the thing that I'm interested in is taking stories like The Long Night and giving the player agency and allowing them to explore and immerse and pick through stories at their own pace and to their own level of detail. So, for example, what I enjoy about the format, and one of the things I enjoy writing when I take text like The Long Night, I really, really enjoy the idea that a player who, for example, may be a 15-year-old in a classroom setting may interact with this very lightly, and rush through the story and just hit the core beats, and we'll understand the story from start to finish, and the whole thing will happen very quickly. But then there are other players who may wish to really immerse themselves in the whole thing and really click everything and explore everything and give themselves a depth of storytelling. And for me, I quite enjoy the idea of depth. And the reason is that a lot of interactive fiction, you know, I'm sure a lot of you will have experienced things like choose your own adventure stories, where you can choose to take the left door or the right door, or slay the dragon or run away. They're very binary choices, and you end up very, very far away in different places, or you'll live or you'll die, that kind of thing. Whereas The Long Night is interesting because it is a real account and it does have a real endpoint, and therefore we must tell the story. So we can't diverge. You know, there isn't a fictional extra endpoint or anything like that. There is a defined space that we have to tell that story in. But what we can do is we can use games and interactive fiction to tell a much richer version of the story, if that makes sense. And that, for me, is the power of interactive storytelling, is allowing the player to go deeper rather than end up somewhere else sometimes. Does that kind of cover it, Noemie?
Yes, very quickly. Yes, it does. And I think we can, you know, go, what I think is so important, which we lose when we lose a survivor, is actually going into the person's skin through this narrative game. So they're actually reliving it. And that's a very powerful experience. And I feel that many people, we were talking, Dan and I, earlier on, whether we call it a digital book or a digital game. And some people nowadays are averse to reading. So whether we then therefore turn off our younger audience by calling it the book, but it is in effect that you are reliving it, and it's a very good way of reliving it, a very direct way. And exactly like Dan says, we have the opportunity to layer it almost for the various ages, that you have multiple experiences, you know. And I was talking, being the devil in there, saying, you know, could we do some lateral games and all that? But as Dan quite rightly said, sometimes it's all too much. So there's a lot of scope, and I think it's exciting. And the other thing about our game, it will be available to everybody. It can be used on the phone, on the computer, on any sort of smart device. And I think that's the answer for the future: reach the many. And as Dan said to me before, I'm using your words, Dan, so it's not really fair, it is to reach an audience that wouldn't otherwise be gaming and be doing that. And likewise with the Holocaust, attract an audience that wouldn't necessarily turn to the Holocaust, but it might be a lighter way to do that. So
yeah, I think the audience is really important with this kind of work. So, for example, the Closed Hands project was a 2-year project, and it was funded by the Arts Council in the UK, which to my knowledge is the first major games work to be funded as a piece of digital art, really. And what it meant was that we had to really think about who this thing was for. And it's something that we would need to do for The Long Night, really, to go, okay, who is the actual audience for this? And for me, there are 2 sort of subsections of the audience that I'm particularly interested in, that I think this kind of work in an educational setting can really target. The first is games players who potentially aren't used to interacting with challenging subject matter. So these are people who are playing mainstream games, potentially unaware or disinterested in the idea of a game experience tackling quite difficult subject matter. And then I suppose more interestingly to me sometimes is the audience that are already well versed in tackling subject matter, might watch challenging cinema or read widely, that kind of thing, but who are unaware that games exist, and games do this, and games are telling these stories, and they're doing so not in a gimmicky way, but in a way that reframes stories intelligently and sensitively. So a lot of that thinking had to be done very, very early on for my project, and hopefully it will be done so for this one as well. But it's a really good exercise to do, to think, well, you're potentially making games in this space for an audience who don't speak games, and that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And so you then have to think very, very carefully about the way in which you interact with games and the way you describe the game. You know, if I so it's almost a ridiculous example, but I mentioned to my mum that I'd nearly finished this game, and she said, "Oh, I'd like to try it." And she said, "How do I get it on my iPad?" And it was like, "Well, it's on your computer." And she immediately panicked because the idea of installing a game on her computer was a bit much. But then if I'd reframed that and said, "Oh, it's just a bit of software, it's just like an app," you know, if I'd have called it an app instead of a game, she would have been much more happy to download it and install it. And sometimes it's as simple as just reframing how you refer to something for different audiences, particularly when the audience is not necessarily super tech literate, you know. So that's quite an important thing to bear in mind.